Gemini 3.6 Flash, MiniMax M3, and DeepSeek V4 Flash all claim the fast and cheap lane in AI right now. So I ran cost, coding, speed, context, and deployment head-to-head to see who actually earns that claim. The surprise is that the model everyone assumes is the budget option, DeepSeek V4 Flash, doesn't just win on price. It also posts the best agentic coding scores of the three. This is the test that decides whether your monthly bill stays sane once you're running thousands of calls a day. Gemini 3.6 Flash charges $1.50 per million input tokens and $7.50 per million output tokens, according to official docs. MiniMax M3 sits in the middle at 30 cents input and $1.20 output, after what the company calls a permanent 50% cut. DeepSeek V4 Flash undercuts both at 14 cents input and 28 cents output on a cash miss. Run the math on output alone, and Gemini is roughly 10 times more expensive than DeepSeek for the exact same job. That's not a rounding error once you're generating anything at volume. At a heavy 10 million output tokens a month, DeepSeek would cost you roughly $2.80. Gemini would cost you around $75 for that same volume. DeepSeek V4 Flash wins this test clean, and it isn't close. Price alone doesn't prove a model can code, though, so let's see if the cheapest option can actually back that up. That puts the scoreboard at DeepSeek 1, MiniMax 0, Gemini 0. My name is Brian, and I'm an AI expert who plays with these tools for 12 hours a day so you don't have to. Pick the wrong model for an agentic coding loop and you spend your afternoon cleaning up its mess instead of shipping. On DeepSWE, the benchmark that measures long-horizon software engineering work, Gemini 3.6 Flash scores 49%, vendor reported. DeepSeek V4 Flash scores 54.4, also vendor reported on its own harness. On SWE Bench, verified, MiniMax M3 posts 80.5% from a Hugging Face listing, and DeepSeek V4 Flash posts 79% on its own preview build. Those two numbers are close enough and from different enough versions that I'm calling this one a tie. Gemini doesn't have a published figure here at all, so it sits this comparison out. Terminal Bench 2.1 is where the gap opens up for real. This benchmark tests agentic tool use, actually operating inside a terminal to get a task done. One of the biggest problems I run into when using AI agents is turning their output into YouTube content I can actually use to market my product. That's why this video is sponsored by Subscriber, a tool that helps business owners connect their AI agents to YouTube and market their products without spending 10 hours every week creating content. You can connect Claude or ChatGPT directly to Subscriber. It then analyzes your business, website, and YouTube channel to help you create SEO-optimized video ideas, scripts, thumbnails, and even complete videos that actually match your brand. What I like most is that every week, Subscriber gives me a list of high-potential video ideas I can immediately execute, and it can even help edit videos for me, with or without my face, including videos like the one you're watching right now. It's easy to get started, and you can try Subscriber for free using the link in the description below. Now back to the video. MiniMax M3 scores 66%. DeepSeek V4 Flash scores 82.7. That's a real clean lead, and it's the benchmark that best reflects what an agent actually does all day. DeepSeek V4 Flash wins this test. The scoreboard now reads DeepSeek 2, MiniMax 0, Gemini 0. But raw intelligence doesn't matter if the thing is too slow to sit inside a real-time workflow, which is exactly what the next test settles. These are different setups, so I'm calling this directional rather than a lab-verified head-to-head. But DeepSeek's higher number on the harder, more agentic benchmark is a real signal worth weighing. A model that's this cheap and this good at agentic coding is starting to look like more than a budget pick. A model that codes brilliantly but crawls breaks the feel of working with it. On raw output throughput, Gemini 3.6 Flash puts out roughly 304 tokens a second. DeepSeek V4 Flash runs around 121 tokens a second. MiniMax M3 trails at about 89 tokens a second. These numbers come from artificial analysis and other community sources rather than one controlled test, so treat them as directional. But the gap is wide enough that the ranking holds regardless of exactly which number you trust. Gemini's raw speed is genuinely the fastest of the three, close to 3 times MiniMax's throughput. But time to first token tells a completely different story. Gemini takes somewhere between 12 and 15 seconds before it says a single word. MiniMax answers in 1.6 to 2.2 seconds. DeepSeek answers even faster, in 1.1 to 1.4 seconds. That's the trade-off. Gemini generates text quickly once it starts, but you're sitting there for over 10 seconds waiting on it to start. For a pipeline that fires hundreds of short calls a day, that startup delay adds up to real dead time. But DeepSeek's response time is the one that actually feels faster in a real back and forth, since a 2-second wait beats a 10-second one every time you hit enter. Gemini 3.6 Flash wins the sustained throughput test outright, so that moves the scoreboard to DeepSeek 2, MiniMax 0, Gemini 1. Stick with me, because the last 4 tests are where this decision actually flips. A model that cuts your answer off mid-generation forces you to stitch pieces back together by hand, and that's exactly where this test gets interesting. All 3 of these models publish close to the same headline context window, right around 1 million tokens. Gemini 3.6 Flash sits at 1,048,576. MiniMax M3 and DeepSeek V4 Flash both list an even 1 million. The real gap shows up in max output, the amount a model can actually hand back in a single response. Gemini 3.6 Flash caps out at 65,536 tokens. DeepSeek V4 Flash goes further, at 393,216. MiniMax M3 goes furthest of all, at 524,288, roughly 8 times Gemini's ceiling and about a third larger than DeepSeek's. That matters if you're generating a long document or running an agent that needs to write out a huge amount of code in one pass without a manual restart. MiniMax M3. There is a real caveat on context and output limits worth naming before we score it. That's basically a tie, and none of these 3 separates itself on context alone. Next up is deployment and modality, the test that quietly decides whether the rest of this comparison even matters. On deployment and modality, MiniMax M3 pulled clearly ahead once the workload got real. So MiniMax M3 takes deployment and modality, and the scoreboard shifts its way. Here is where Gemini 3.6 Flash clearly pulls ahead of the field. Now, here is where MiniMax M3 clearly pulls ahead of the field. Here is where DeepSeek V4 Flash clearly pulls ahead of the field. Pick the one whose single biggest strength matches the job in front of you today. One thing the docs never spell out will quietly cost you if you miss it. If this helped, the next breakdown on the channel goes even deeper.